subscribe. Introduction: How to make your own wine. At one time or another you must have sent away for something. A do-it-yourself kit, of some sort. Something that gave you instructions on how to make, build, or create something. Something that you seen was important to you, so you sent away for it, and just had to do it for yourself. That's what this electronic book is about. The complete guide to making your own wine is a computer book and instructional on how to make wine. Made simple, with easy to understand instructions on how to get the job done. It requires very little money and very little effort. It does require a bit of time, but this is due to the fermenting process. When you get right down to it, everything requires time. When was the last time you went to the bank to make a simple withdrawal? That's time. We all know that you can't rush aging of any kind. The supplies required for making wine will be the biggest obstacle. I have discovered that most kitchens have enough utensils to more than get the job done. However, there are very few supplies that are specialized. I have uncovered several places that specialize in this field. They cater to the winemakers all over the United States, and even ship supplies abroad. So you're covered, and very well I might add. No winemaker has to scrounge, as in the past. I should say that making wine is one of the most satisfying things that you will ever achieve. Simply because it's really simple, and because time does all the grunt work for you. Starting information. The simple methods described here are designed for beginners who do not know where to begin and for those with some experience who frequently run into difficulties and disappointments. The making of top quality wines is absurdly simple, yet not quite so simple that we can be careless about it. Too many people are still following Granny's fruit mixtures to ferment of their own accord, leaving bottles of fermenting wines corked loosely, the three main causes of ruined wines, while others are still preparing their fruits and other ingredients in a manner which 9 times out of 10 produces cloudy, acid wines that more often than not find their way down the drain. If your previous attempts have not been up to expectations, there is a reason. This will be found within these pages as well as the essential, yet simple, information that ensures success in making what is, surely, the finest home product on earth. I repeatedly make it clear that I am an advocate of simplicity. There are many highly complicated scientific and chemical aspects underlying amateur winemaking. A few home operators begin to dabble in these, so that, to them, winemaking becomes a grueling test of knowledge and skill. Expensive laboratory equipment becomes necessary, as does some experience in laboratory techniques, and from then on all pleasures are lost in a worrying maze of technicalities. And all for no reason at all, because their wines are no better than those turned out by the simple methods and recipes here. However, so that readers understand the reason for wines being spoiled, I have included a few chemical details so that the very beginner not only knows what to do and how to do it, but also why he is doing it in one particular way. Success is thus assured. Nevertheless, he will need no knowledge of chemistry and no more in the way of utensils than is already available in most homes. Using utensils for making wines with the recipes and ingredients here, all one needs is a gallon-sized glass bottle, an unchipped enamel saucepan, and a polythene pail. Make certain to use polythene, as some plastics are not suitable. Don't use aluminum or copper vessels, and do not use an enamel vessel not ordinarily intended for cooking purposes, as these often contain lead in the glaze, and this could render wines poisonous. Fermentation will not be carried out in an open vessel such as a crock or polythene pail in all these recipes unless you want it to. It is best to ferment the liquors in a gallon-sized glass bottle. This point will be covered again later on. A polythene pail is necessary for only a few of the recipes and may be disregarded for the time being. The art of fermentation. This is the process by which the liquors we prepare are turned into wine, and we have nothing to do with it. All we do when making wine is to prepare a liquid containing substances that will give a pleasant flavor to what will eventually become a finished wine. The yeast we add turns the liquid into wine for us. Ordinarily, baker's yeast and white granulated sugar are used by the average home winemaker. However, over the past few years, winemaking has taken such a hold that suppliers of equipment and ingredients offer a wide range of yeasts, especially imported from the wine-producing areas of France, Italy and Germany. These yeasts make the finest wines, because they are true wine yeasts, whereas baker's yeast in only bread yeast and should not be expected to make good wine, though of course it does, but not to be compared with the results following the use of wine yeasts. Wine yeast is capable of producing 18% of alcohol by volume, 32 proof, against the 14% of baker's yeast. More and more people are using these wine yeasts together with invert sugar instead of household sugar. Yeast is obtainable in the form of a compressed cake, dried tablet, pellet, or in powder form as a liquid culture, and all are inactive dormant at the time of purchase. When making our wines, fermentation is seen as a slight frothing during the early stages, and this soon settles down to a gentle ferment that may last as long as 6 months. But if warmth is given, as we shall see later on, fermentation should be over and done within half that time. All the time fermentation is going on, that is, all the time the yeast continues to reproduce itself, the amount of alcohol in the wine increases. But it cannot go on forever, because when what we call the maximum alcohol tolerance of the yeast is reached, the alcohol formed kills the yeast. It will be seen then that from the tiny amount of yeast we add at the start, masses of new yeast is made, and all this helps to make alcohol until the last surviving generation of the original yeast is finally destroyed by the alcohol it and all the other generations put together have formed since we began. When this happens, fermentation ceases and no more alcohol is made. Thus the old tale that the longer wine is kept the stronger it becomes is proven a fallacy or old wives' tale. As already mentioned, baker's yeast can make up to 14% of alcohol by volume, while wine yeast makes from 15% to 18% by volume. To get the maximum alcohol and to get fermentation over without undue waste of time, we must keep the fermenting wine warm. The ideal temperature at which to keep a must is between 65 degrees F and 70 degrees F. However, few can manage this, but if fermenting wines are kept warm throughout fermentation time, this will do. Most people use an airing cupboard for this, and it works well. Others use all sorts of ingenious devices, and these are described under he heading aids to fermentation. Don't be tempted to keep a must hot during fermentation. During the warmer weather, almost any warm spot in the kitchen will do, but during cold weather, and especially during very cold nights, it is always best if a little added warmth can be given. When a ferment is allowed to become cold, the yeast ceases to work. This means that at some time later, if the weather turns warm, fermentation begins again. If the wine has been bottled in the belief that fermentation has ceased for good, the result is a popping under the stairs and corks flying in all directions and the loss of valuable wine. Fermentation aids. Most beginners will be content to keep their fermenting wines warm in an airing cupboard or near the boiler in the kitchen. Others will want to know how they can make a special fermenting cupboard if only 2 or 3 jars of wine are fermenting at one time. A small cupboard with a small electric heater installed will be ideal. Alternatively, an electric light bulb hanging in a cupboard and the jars grouped round this will serve the purpose just as well, especially if the cupboard is just large enough to accommodate the jars and not so big that a lot of warmth is lost. I know of people who group several jars round a small safety paraffin lamp, but this would only be satisfactory when the wine is under a fermentation lock. Otherwise, the wine might become tainted by fumes. Other aids to satisfactory fermentation are good nutrients. Yeast nutrients, as they are called, are carefully balanced yeast foods which assist the yeast to reproduce and therefore make the largest possible amount of alcohol. Sufficient nutrient speeds fermentation so much that, once you have used a good one, You will always do, sir. I know from my vast experience that warmth, a good yeast and good nutrient will together make wines 10 times better than any old yeast. No nutrient and a warm atmosphere one day and a chilly one the next. We want the best. Very well, let us take just that little extra care and spend those few extra coppers which will make such an immense difference to the finished product. Suppliers of special ingredients offer a variety of nutrients. They're accompanied by directions how to prepare. In most cases, it's just a matter of mixing the nutrient with some of the prepared liquor and then adding it to the brew with the yeast. Now a word about invert sugar. Most of you will be content to use household sugar, and it is household sugar that I include in the recipes. However, I have proved beyond doubt that invert sugar gives better results. This is also obtainable from the same fires. A summary of the foregoing is this: the inexperienced wine maker who uses baker's yeast, no nutrient, household sugar, and who allows the wine to ferment anywhere cannot possibly expect the results which can be achieved by following my advice. By doing so, anyone, including beginner who don't have to enjoy years of apprenticeship, with the aid of a fermentation log, by keeping the wine warm during the whole of the fermenting period, using the appropriate wine yeast, invert sugar and nutrient, will obtain wines with a strength, clarity, flavor and bouquet of which they will be justly proud. When baker's yeast is used, it's crumbled into the prepared liquor. When wine yeast is used, the directions supplied by the dealer must be followed. This involves starting what is called a nucleus ferment. A half-pint mild bottle will do. For this, about a quarter pint of water and a teaspoonful of sugar are boiled together for a minute and then allowed to cool. This is then put into the milk bottle, sterilized as directed later on, and the yeast then added in whatever form it's obtained. The neck of the bottle is then plugged with cotton wool and put into a warm place. Within a few days, usually 3, this little lot is fermenting merrily, ready for adding to a batch of wine that you will be waiting to make. If you prepare the liquor for wine making and then add the wine yeast, it will take 3 or 4 days to begin to ferment. Better therefore to get the nucleus fermenting ready to add to the liquor when you have prepared it, so that the whole lot is quickly in a state of vigorous fermentation. It's most important that the yeast is not added to hot, because a temperature well below boiling will destroy the yeast. Let the little drop of sugar water cool well before adding the yeast, and later let the prepared liquor cool well before adding the nucleus, or starter bottle as we call it. In the recipes I shall refer to adding the yeast as adding the nucleus, on the assumption that you will have taken my advice and will be using wine yeasts prepared as directed. But if you must use baker's yeast, merely crumble this into the liquor of the time you would add the nucleus. It will be seen in the recipes that all the sugar is not used at once. This is because yeast ferments much better if the sugar is fed to it in stages. Too much sugar at the outset might cause the yeast to stop fermenting at around 10% of alcohol. Inexperienced operators might think fermentation has finished naturally and put their wine in a cool place to clear, which, of course, it would do. But it would be an oversweet wine, likely to start fermenting again at any time. For a simple restatement, having prepared the liquor as the recipes advise, the yeast or nucleus is added together with the nutrient and the wine put in a warm place until all fermentation has ceased. In some of the recipes, chiefly those calling for flavoring to be added at a late stage of production, directions read: leave until fermentation has nearly ceased. This is rather a broad term to beginners, but where fermentation logs are in use, they will know when this stage is reached, because the water will remain pushed up to one side of the lock, and a bubble just manages to push through every 2 or 3 minutes. Where fermentation logs are not in use, but where clear glass jars are being used, beginners will be able to see the bubbles of gas rising all the time. There is quite a mass of them rising steadily. Fermentation is quite vigorous. But when there is only the faintest trace of a line of bubbles round the perimeter of the wine, and where only a few bubbles are seen rising slowly to the surface, they may say, for all intents and purposes, that fermentation has nearly ceased, though it may go on for several more weeks. The clearing process. With the recipes and methods described here, there is no need to use isinglass or any other aids to clarifying these. Wines clear themselves usually before fermentation has ceased. Indeed, it is usual to have a brilliantly clear wine a month before fermentation has ceased. If 1 or 2 lots of wine appear to be slow to clear, do not worry, a week or 2 after fermentation has finally stopped clarifying will take place very quickly. It's important to bear in mind that a clear wine usually has a little deposit to throsa, that it is always best to leave the wine for at least a month after it has become crystal clear in order that the last of the impurities and perhaps some unseen yeast cloud has time to settle out. If this is not done, a slight sediment might form in the bottles, and when you begin to pour the wine into a glass, the sediment is churned up so that it clouds the wine. Such a happening is not a calamity, as the cloud will settle again, probably overnight, but it means putting the bottle away. It's best, when all fermentation has ceased, to siphon the clear wine, if not yet crystal clear, into another jar, leaving the deposit behind. Then when the wine is finally crystal clear, it should be siphoned into bottles. This racking, as we call it, helps to get the slight cloudiness to settle out quickly. Natural enemies. The enemies of successful winemaking are wild yeasts and acetic bacteria. The acetic bacteria, which converts alcohol into acetic acid, thereby turning wine to vinegar, is ever present in the air. Similarly, the yeasts and spores of fungi which turn wine insipid and flat or turn it sour are also in the air. When using fresh fruit and other ingredients from the garden or from shops, these bacteria and yeasts and fungi are already on them, but they are easily destroyed so that they do no harm. The ingredients we shall be using will be supplied in sealed containers so that they will not already be contaminated by the causes of spoilage, as we call them. However, the water we use might contain harmful bacteria that can spoil the wine, or possibly wild yeast which can cause what we call undesirable ferments. These ferments give off flavors, to put it politely, otherwise sour flavors, as we refer to sourness in milk, not acid flavors. Anyway, the methods described here ensure the destruction of all harmful yeasts and bacteria at the outset, so they need not worry you. Now, if wild yeasts and bacteria are in the air, they must be on corks, inside bottles and jars. Indeed, they are on everything we use, but they are easily destroyed so that success is assured. It's not generally known that the molds on cheese, half-empty pots of meat paste and jam are often yeasts growing there, and it is this kind of yeast floating about in the air that ruins our wines if we allow it to settle. To defeat this souring yeast, we must keep our fermenting wines and finished wines covered closely. Treatment of finished wines is covered under the heading storing. Covering fermenting wines in jars is very simple, but most important. Add soon as the prepared yeast has been added to the prepared liquid. The top of the jar should be covered with a piece of polythene. This should be pressed down all around by hand, and strong string tied tightly around. This will keep airborne diseases away from the wine, because the gas generated during fermentation will find an outlet for itself and keep up a constant outgoing stream, thus preventing the diseases air contains from gaining access. Far better than this polythene covering is a fermentation lock. The whole idea of fitting a fermentation lock is to prevent air and airborne diseases reaching the wine. Firstly, the lock is fitted to a drilled cork, and the cork then fitted to the jar. Water is then poured into the level shown. The gas formed during fermentation pushes through the water in the form of bubbles, but airborne diseases are kept out. Better than water in the lock is a little of the sterilizing solution described latter, or a crushed and dissolved Camden tablet. This is best because if, as sometimes happens, a vacuum forms in the jar, the air drawn in is purified by the sterilizing solution. When a vacuum forms inside the jar, the lock works in reverse for a while, and this often happens when warm wine is put into a jar and the lock fitted at once. But don't worry if this happens, because as soon as gas has been generated, the lock will begin working properly. Another advantage of having a fermentation lock in use is that it indicates when the fermentation has ceased. All the time the bubbles are passing through, and all the time the water in the lock remains pushed up to one side, it means that there is pressure in the jar, and that this pressure is gas being formed by the act of fermentation. When the fermentation ceases for good, the water returns to normal. During the early stages of fermentation, bubbles are running through the water at a rate of 1 a second or even faster than this, but as fermentation slows down they become far less frequent. Later on, the water remains pushed to one side and it may take 5 or even 10 minutes for sufficient gas to make one bubble. During the very last stages of fermentation, it may take a week for one bubble to push through clearly. Then, all the time the water remains pushed up to one side, the wine should be left, as it is safe to say that fermentation is still going on when the water returns to normal. Give the jar a vigorous twist and the chances are that you will get fermentation on the go again for a day or two longer. If the whole idea in using logs is to keep airborne diseases from contaminating the wine, we must ensure that the bung and lock are airtight. If they are not, the gas leaking will prevent air reaching the wine during the early stages, but as it slows down, the outgoing stream of gas through the leakage holes would not be strong enough for this, so that airborne diseases could easily reach the wine. Having fitted the lock to the bung and jar, run a little sealing wax round where the bungs enter the far and where the lock enters the bung. This precaution may not be necessary, but it's better to be on the safe side. When fermentation has ceased, the lock and bung are removed in one piece and a new bung inserted. The wine is then put away to clear as mentioned before. Note: I have advised sealing wax above, but candle wax does just as well. Where fermentation is carried on in a polythene pail or similar fermenting vessel during the early stages of production, the top of the vessel should be pulled down all around and then secured with thin strong string or a tightly fitting elastic band. The gas generated during this early vigorous ferment will find an outlet for itself and keep up a constant outgoing stream so that airborne diseases cannot gain access. Sterilization. As mentioned, wild yeast and bacteria are likely to be inside bottles, jars and on corks, etc. Therefore, if we are to prevent them damaging our wines, they must be destroyed. Better than boiling bottles, etc., in a pail of water or baking them in an oven is to use a sterilizing solution that does the job in a matter of seconds. This may be made up as follows. Get 2 OZs of sodium metabisulfite or potassium metabisulfite, there being 2 forms. Nearly fill a half-gallon bottle with warm water and then add the crystals or powder and revolve the fire until all is dissolved. Try to use a glass stoppered jar or bottle for this. To sterilize bottles and jars with this, pour a pint into the first bottle and shake it up so that all the inside is wetted. Then pour it into the next bottle and so on, and then back to the bulk again. Having treated the bottles, it's best to rinse them out with boiled water that has cooled well. This will rid the bottles of the rather pungent odor of the sterilizing solution. But don't worry, a slight whiff remains in the bottles, because it will do no harm. Having rinsed the bottles, let them drain for a minute or two. And they are now ready for use. Corks. More wine has been ruined through using unsterilized corks than through any other cause. The crevices of corks teem with all sorts of harmful bacteria and spoilage yeasts. The best way to sterilize them is to put them in a small basin with something heavy on top to keep them submerged. A heavy cup will do, and then cover with the sterilizing solution. Leave this for about 10 minutes, and during the time you are bottling a batch of wine, as each cork is required, take it, dip it in boiled water and then wipe it dry with a cloth dipped in the sterilizing solution, which incidentally is known as sulfur dioxide or sulfite solution. The drying of corks is necessary to prevent the weight of the wine pushing out the corks when the bottles are put away on their sides. Siphon, bottling and how to store. It's almost impossible to pour clear wine from one bottle to another without stirring up the lees deposit. The best method is to siphon the clear wine at bottling time. First, put the bottle or jar of wine on a table and the empty bottles on a box or stool on the floor. Then, using a yard and a half of surgical rubber or plastic tubing, siphoning is quite a simple operation. Put one end of the tubing in the full jar or the first of the full bottles and suck the other end until the wine comes As soon as this happens, pinch the tube at your lips and, while holding on tightly, put this end in the first empty bottle and let the wine flow. As the empty bottle nearly fills, slowly press the tube between finger and thumb in order to cur off the flow slowly, rather than with a jerk. Sudden stoppage often stirs up the deposit. When the bottle has filled to the shoulders, pinch the tube at the neck of the bottle being filled and put this end into the next bottle and let the wine flow again. As the level in the full jar falls, lower the tube into the wine. But be careful not to lower so far that the deposit begins to be sucked into the tubing. A good way of avoiding this is to ask a chemist to let you have 15 inches of quarter-inch tubing and get him to bend the last inch of one end upwards. Then fit the straight end to the rubber tubing you have. At siphoning time, insert the glass tube to the bottom of the full jar of wine. The bend in the tube will rest on the bottom of the jar, but the opening of the end bent upwards will remain above the lees. Now let me give the impatient winemaker a warning. I know how nice it is to build up a stock and build it quickly, but don't be in such a hurry that you put wines away that are not yet perfectly clear. This results in disappointment upon opening if, as often happens, you decide to try a bottle of the oldest and the best you have for some special friend and find that you have stirred up a deposit and clouded what you imagine to be a perfectly clear wine. A reliable test to decide whether a wine is perfectly clear or not and one I always carry out before bottling for storage purposes is to hold a high-powered torch against the bottle. If there is no suggestion of a beam passing through a haze, then the wine is as clear as you will get it, but if there is a slight beam of light, leave the wine to clear perfectly. You will soon get used to this little test and be saved from what might be a most embarrassing position. Finally, when the clear wine has been bottled and the corks have been rammed home, they should be sliced off level with the rim of the bottles. Sealing wax should then be run over the whole surface and the bottles stored on their sides. Sealing and storing in this fashion is important because it allows for the wine to keep the cork moist and to prevent shrinkage. Shrinkage would cause cracking in the sealing wax, with the result that tiny air holes would appear through which wild yeast and bacteria can attack the wine. In the ordinary way, a well-made wine that is one made with good yeast and nutrient is strong enough in alcohol to preserve itself. A goodly percentage of alcohol acts as its own preservative and that of the wine itself. But poorly made wines are low in alcohol and can be spoiled in the bottles if air reaches them. Our wine, made by the recipes and directions here, will contain enough alcohol to destroy any wild yeast or bacteria that might reach it owing to shrinkage of corks. Nevertheless, it is still important that air is not allowed to reach the wine, because if it did so, for prolonged periods the quality would deteriorate, the flavor suffer and much of the bouquet be lost. Experienced winemakers, myself included, use the new plastic seals which when fitted to a bottle of wine shrink tightly, effecting a perfect airtight seal. I expect you have come across these often enough on bottles of cordial. The Tenoiret extracts described in later chapters are fitted with these. When these capsules, as they are called, are used, the bottles may be stored upright. Storing bottles horizontally often presents a problem for some people, but friends of mine with a small cupboard to spare have lined it with orange boxes. In each partition they have fitted soft drink cardboard crates so that each orange box holds 24 bottles on their sides. Having heard that wines must be stored at a temperature which should remain constant throughout the year, people are going to all sorts of trouble and thinking up all sorts of ingenious devices to achieve that end. Opinion is divided as to the ideal temperature in which to store wines, probably because wines, like human beings, prefer what suits them individually. The temperature suitable for one wine is not necessarily best for another. Rapid changes of temperature are certainly best avoided, so if you can store your wines on a stone floor or in a cupboard which has a stone floor, so much the better. If you cannot do this, store your wines where you can and don't worry. Maturing. I am afraid I always have to suppress a grin when people ask me how long a wine needs to mature, because I know that all they really want to know is how soon they can drink it. It is surprising the number of people who simply will not believe that wines improve with age. They set about making wines possessed of urgency which should not exist and an impatience that is hard to believe. They really believe that wine can be made, matured and drunk in 6 or 7 weeks. With luck, you might get fermentation over and done with and your wine's clear and bottled in that time, and truly they are drinkable even so young, and it's an enormous but wine tasted at that tender age cannot be compared with the same wine tasted a year later. It's impossible to describe the changes that take place, but take place they do. Chemical changes are taking place constantly, so that one batch of wine does not taste the same when sampled at intervals of 6 weeks. I know full well that you will be itching to get your teeth into these wines, and I cannot blame you for that. I'm the same myself, always anxious to sample the latest batch to be bottled off, and it is a waste of time for me to tell you to keep it at least a year before drinking because I know you'll never manage it, especially after you had a taste of it when siphoning it into bottles. But please do this for your own sake. At bottling time, put, say 2 bottles in the attic or someplace where they cannot be reached easily. Send them to me if you like. Seriously, those 2 bottles of each lot made will soon amount up to a nice little stock. The remaining 4 bottles from each gallon may be used as required. The whole secret of building up a stock is to make several lots at the same time, and when a jar is emptied at bottling time, start again with another lot. In this way you will always have a few gallons fermenting, several dozen bottles for use as required, and a dozen or so slowly growing into a nice reserve. Then, when the first 2 bottles put away are a year or 2 old, you may sample them. These will have become such magnificent wines in that time that your lesson will have been well and truly learned, and the vow taken that henceforth half of all that is bottled is going to the attic. I hope it does, and I hope even more that you will be able to keep some of it for 5 years at least. For at 5 years it is better than age 4, and at 3 years old it is better than age 2. I have proved all this to myself and have a few bottles of wine that I made over 15 years ago. Brief, but important. Fermentation logs. There is no substitute for the fermentation log, although many people use a balloon stretched over the jar instead of a fermentation log, and provided this is a tight fit, it will certainly protect the wine. But this cannot give any indication as to when fermentation has ceased. The balloon is fitted over the neck, and as gas escapes into it, slight inflation takes place, and as pressure grows the gas forced out round the neck of the jar. Another substitute for the lock is a 3-inch piece of 1/4-inch bore glass tubing stuffed with cotton wool and fitted in the same way as the lock. But, as with a balloon, this can give no indication as to when fermentation has ceased. Yeast and adding it will be seen in the recipes that I give, yeast, without mentioning any kind. This is because some of you will be using baker's yeast and others one of the many varieties of wine yeast. In the directions which accompany the recipes, the time to add the yeast is clearly stated. If baker's yeast is used, use half an ounce and crumble this into the jar at the time advised. Experienced winemakers and those using wine yeasts for the first time will have their little nucleus ferments ready, and these will be added at the time advised in the directions given with each recipe. Sugar, water, syrup. In the recipes and directions it will be seen that the sugar and water are added to the mixtures as a syrup. Make sure the sugar has dissolved before the water comes to the boil, and so that mistakes do not occur, label the jar so that you know how much sugar has to be added at each stage. There is no need to be exact when adding 1/3 or whatever the direction happens to be, but it is a good plan to have the total amount of sugar to be used at the outset put aside. In this way, when all has been added you will know there is no more to go in, and you will not be left wondering if you have used as much as you should have done. Gallon jars. Someone is sure to ask before they begin, how can I get a gallon of water, the flavoring, and all that sugar into a 1-gallon jar? The fact is that, in the way we shall be doing it is quite a simple matter. Gallon jars hold half a pint more than a gallon when full, and because we shall be Adding the sugar in stages, most of each lot of sugar will be used up before the next is added. Before the last lot of sugar and water is added, the wine is transferred to another jar and the deposit thrown away. This will leave space for the last lot of syrup to be added. If, through some misfortune, this is not quite the case, put the little remaining syrup in a freshly sterilized screw-stoppered bottle and screw down tightly. This will keep it safe for the few days necessary for fermentation to reduce the liquor in the jar and so make room for that little drop of leftover. If at the time called for in the recipes you do not have a second jar in which to put the fermenting wine at the time given for disposing of the deposit, you may pour the wine into any suitable container, then throw away the deposit. Clean out the jar, sterilize it and then return the wine to it. Saucepans. If it happens that your saucepans are not quite large enough to hold the sugar and 5 pints of water that is to be boiled at the first stage of making the wine, boil the sugar in a quart of water and the remaining 3 pints of water in another saucepan, then mix fresh fruit wines. There is no need for me to mention the enormous popularity this branch of home winemaking enjoys, or that countless thousands of people all over the world embark with tremendous enthusiasm each summer upon turning wild fruits and surplus garden fruits into wines fit to grace the tables of a banqueting hall. Just let me say that, no matter how advanced methods become and how easily obtainable special ingredients for winemaking are, there will always be in the hearts of everyone a place for the true country wines, for they have that indefinable something which sets them apart from all others, a uniqueness that cannot be found in any other wine, either commercial or home produced. The methods I use myself are described here, and although they are the simplest and the surest ever evolved, it's necessary to point out the complications that arise if these methods are not used years ago, and, I am very sorry to say, even today many thousands of unfortunate home winemakers are following methods which advocate crush the fruit, add the water and leave to ferment. Other methods advise boiling the fruits. In both cases disappointment is almost a certainty, and the reason for this is easy enough to understand. The grey-white bloom that forms on grapes and other fruits is yeast put there by nature, and it may be said that the first wine known to early man was the result of this yeast. Fermenting fruits crushed for a purpose other than winemaking. In the ordinary way, this yeast might well make good wine if allowed to ferment alone. Unfortunately, with this yeast comes what we term undesirable yeast, wild yeast, and several kinds of bacteria, each of which can ruin our wines. They bring about what we call undesirable ferments that usually take place at the same time as the ferment we want to take place, so that instead of a wine of quality, the result is one tasting of flat beer or cloudy, evil-smelling liquid fit only for disposal. Another bacterium, known as the vinegar bacterium, will turn wines into vinegar. Since there is nothing we can do when any of these calamities has occurred, they must be prevented from happening. Clearly, we must destroy all these enemies before beginning. The simplest method is, of course, at first thought anyway, is to boil the fruits. But here rises another problem. All fruits contain pectin, a glutinous substance which causes jams to set. Boiling fruit releases pectin. This pectin holds itself and minute solids in suspension, giving the wine a cloudiness that is impossible to clarify or even filter out. We may put the crushed fruit through a jelly bag to remove every particle of pectin-bearing fruit and then boil the juice only, but this is a messy, tedious job that takes hours and eliminates all the pleasure. Our method, known as the sulfiting method, does just this, and produces full-bodied, crystal-clear wines easily and quickly without fuss or bother. All that is necessary to achieve this are tablets costing just pennies. Camden fruit-preserving tablets are available in bottles of 20 from most chemists, in the ordinary way, and provided the fruit is not too heavily affected with wild yeast and bacteria, one tablet will destroy the undesirable element contained in 1 gallon of crushed brewed pulp, but we cannot be sure of this. Now, 2 tablets will surely do this, but being a comparatively heavy dose, this might also destroy the yeast we shall be adding so that the ferment we desire does not take place. My method takes care of both these risks, not only destroying the wild yeast and bacteria on the fruits, winemaking. Obviously, what we need is a method which will destroy the wild yeast and bacteria on the fruits as boiling does, without actually boiling, and, indeed, without heating our fruits at all, because it needs very little heat to bring out. The Pectinauer method, known as the sulfiting method, does just this and produces full-bodied, crystal-clear wines easily and quickly without fuss or bother. All that is necessary to achieve this are tablets costing just pennies. Campden fruit preserving tablets are available in bottles of 20 from most chemists, in the ordinary way, and provided the fruit is not too heavily affected with wild yeast and bacteria, 1 tablet will destroy the undesirable element contained in 1 gallon of crushed brewed pulp, but we cannot be sure of this. Now, 2 tablets will surely do this, but being a comparatively heavy dose, this might also destroy the yeast we shall be adding so that the ferment we desire does not take place. My method takes care of both these risks, not only destroying the wild yeast and bacteria on the fruits, but also allowing the yeast we add to ferment alone and unhindered to produce wines of clarity and quality, the like of which cannot be produced by any other method. By adding 1 Campden tablet to a good deal less than 1 gallon of fruit pulp this will represent a rough equivalent to 2 tablets per gallon. But before we add our yeasts, we shall have increased the amount of liquid or pulp to nearly twice the amount, consequently reducing the amount of sterilizing solution to half, or the equivalent of 1 Campden tablet per gallon. In this way we achieve our overall aim. Each Campden fruit preserving tablet contains 4 grains of sodium metabisulfite. Therefore, any readers finding Campden tablets in short supply may ask their chemist for 4 grains of sodium metabisulfite or potassium metabisulfite, there being 2 forms, and use this. But because a chemist would find a single order of 4 grains rather trivial, it would be best to ask for, say, 6 or 10 packets each containing 4 grains. If you are making 2-gallon lots of wine, the amount to use would be 8 grains. Don't be tempted to buy by the ounce and measure out a grain, as this is impossible unless you have the appropriate scales. Just in case you happen to be one of those people who, even in these enlightened days, abhors the use of chemicals, let me assure you that sulfur dioxide, the solution which results when Campden tablets are dissolved, is quite harmless to humans when used in the proportions recommended. Indeed, as many as 8 tablets 32 grains may be used with safety, but such heavy dosing would prevent a must fermenting. The sulfiting method is used by the trade, so we shall be following a method well tried and proved. Heaven knows how many hundreds of gallons of wines I have made by this method, and all with the same unfailing success. Method 1 makes wines of the Heber type. Their flavors are more pronounced and their color more full than those produced by method 2. Those wishing for lighter wines more suitable for serving with meals should use method 2. The main difference in the 2 methods is that we ferment the fruit pulp itself in method 1, and the juice only in method 2. It will be appreciated that when fermenting the pulp we must, as a matter of course, get far more from our fruits. But we don't want too much in a light wine, otherwise the subtle difference between a heavier wine and the popular lighter wines is lost. The short pulp ferment of method 1 ensures that we get all the flavor and desirable chemical matter from our fruits in the right proportion. The best method to use for each type of fruit is given with each recipe. It should be taken into account that varied amounts of fruit and sugar with the use of proper method produce distinctly different types of wine. Method 1. Crush the fruit by hand in a polythene pail and pour on 1 quart of boiled water that has cooled. Mix well. Crush 1 Campden tablet and dissolve the powder in about half an egg cupful of warm water and mix this with the fruit pulp. Leave the mixture for 1 or 2 hours. A little bleaching will take place, but this is nothing to worry about. After this, take 1/3 of the sugar to be used, or approximately 1/3, and boil this for 1 minute in 3 pints of water. Allow this syrup to cool and then stir into the pulp. Then add the yeast or nucleus and ferment for 7 days. After 7 days, strain the pulp through fine muslin or other similar material and wring out as dry as you can. Put the strained wine into a gallon jar and throw the pulp away. Then boil another 1/3 of the sugar in 1 pint of water for 1 minute, and when this has cooled, add it to the rest. Plug the neck of the jar with cotton wool or fitter. Fermentation lock and continue to ferment in a warm place for a further 10 days. At this stage, if you have not a spare jar, pour the wine into a polythene pail, leaving as much of the deposit in the jar as you can. Clean out the jar, sterilize it and return the wine to this. The remaining 1/3 of the sugar may now be boiled for 1 minute in the remaining pint of water. When this has cooled, add it to the rest. Refit the lock or plug the neck of the jar with fresh cotton wool. After this, the wine should be left in a warm place until all fermentation has ceased. Note: if there is not quite enough space for all of this last lot of syrup, put the remainder in a sterilized screw-top bottle and store for a few days in a cool place. This may be added when fermentation has reduced the level of the liquid in the jar. If you have to do this, don't forget to refit the lock. Method 2. Crush the fruit in a polythene pail and add 1 quart of boiled water that has cooled. Mix well. Crush 1 Camden tablet and dissolve the powder in about half an egg cupful of warm water and mix this with the fruit pulp. Leave the mixture in a cool place for 24 hours, stirring twice during that time. Strain through fine muslin or other similar material and squeeze gently but not too hard. Discard the fruit pulp. Then boil 1/3 of the sugar in half a gallon of water for 1 minute and allow to cool. Mix this with the juice and return the lot to the polythene pail. Then add the yeast or nucleus and ferment for 10 days. After this, pour the top wine into a gallon jar, leaving as much of the deposit behind as you can. Boil another 1/3 of the sugar in half a pint of water for 1 minute. And when it is cool, add it to the rest. Plug the neck of the jar with cotton wool or fit a fermentation lock and ferment in a warm place for 14 days. After this, boil the remaining sugar in the remaining half pint of water for 1 minute, and when cool, add it to the rest. Refit the lock or plug the neck of the jar with fresh cotton wool and leave in a warm place until all fermentation has ceased. The recipes are designed to make 1 gallon of wine. 2 gallons are being made at once, twice the amount of each ingredient must be used, including Camden tablets, and the sugar and water added in double quantities. This principle applies where 3 or 4 gallons are being made, and it's easy enough to work out. Just to be sure that mistakes don't occur when adding the syrup, sugar and water, stick a label on the jar and note on this the amount added. Readers will be quick to appreciate that certain fruits are more suitable than others for making certain types of wine. Clearly, it would be as hopeless to try to make port from rhubarb as it would be to try to grow potatoes on a pear tree. And I think it is in this respect that many people go astray. They make wines from the cheapest and most readily available fruits naturally enough, but they do not give the slightest thought to what the result will be or whether they will like it or not. Before you begin, decide on the type of wine you are most likely to prefer, and then use the fruit and the method which will make this type of wine. Elderberries make an excellent port-style wine in many variations, each with the basic port style underlying them, so that from this lowly wild fruit we may obtain not only a full-bodied port-style wine, but also a Burgundy style, a claret, and others according to the whim of the operator. Blackberries make similar wines, as do certain varieties of plums, damsons and black currants. The juice from lighter colored fruits such as raspberries, loganberries, red and white currants and others make excellent table wines. But there is no need to cover this aspect fully here, because every recipe is preceded by the name of the type or style of wine that can be expected from each recipe. I say expected, because to guarantee that the wine will be identical to the one expected would be unwise, but only because the amounts of sugar and acid present in the fruits vary from season to season. Indeed, they vary with the type of tree, soil, situation and with the sort of summer we have had while the fruits have been growing. A hot summer produces fruits containing more sugar and less acid than a wet sunless summer, when the effect is the reverse. In each recipe appears the name of the best yeast to use, and this is best added as a nucleus as already described. If you must use baker's yeast or a dried yeast, merely sprinkle it over the surface of the must at the time given in the method you're using. A final word: make sure all fruits are ripe. This is far more important than most people imagine. Half-ripe fruits or those with green patches on them should be discarded, as it needs only 1 or 2 of these to give a gallon of wine an acid bite. Fully ripe fruit is essential if we hope to make the best wine. When we have decided that our garden fruits are ripe enough, or those you have your eye on in the hedgerows, leave them for another 3 or 4 days before gathering. Recipes 132 Berry wines. 1. Blackberry wine. Port style, 4 pounds. Blackberries, 4 pounds. Sugar, or 5 pounds. Invert 7 pts. Water, port yeast, nutrient. Use method 1. Ferment the pulp. 2. Blackberry and elderberry wine, port style, 2.5 pounds. Elderberries, 2.5 pounds. Blackberries, 7 pts. Water, 3.5 pounds. Sugar, or 4 pounds. Invert port yeast, nutrient. Use method 1. Ferment the pulp after crushing and mixing together. 3. Blackberry wine, Burgundy style, 4 to 5 pound. Blackberries, 3 3/8 pounds. Sugar, or 4 pounds. Invert Burgundy yeast, nutrient, 7 pts. Water. Use method 1. Ferment the pulp. 4. Blackberry wine, Beaujolais style. This recipe was passed on to me by a friend. It won first prize among 600 entries on the occasion of the second National Conference and Show for Amateur Winemakers at Bournemouth. Unfortunately, it wasn't my original recipe, or I could have won that prize. 4.5 pounds. Blackberries, 2.5 pounds. Sugar, or 3 pounds. 2 ounces. Invert Burgundy yeast, nutrients 7 pts. Water. Method 1 was used. The wine was, of course, dry. 5. Blackberry wine, light table wine, 3 pounds. Blackberries, 3 pounds. Sugar, 3 3/4 pounds. Invert 7 pts. Water. Burgundy yeast, nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the diluted juice. 6. Blackcurrant wine, port style, 4 pounds. Blackcurrants, 1 pound. Raisins, 3 pounds. Sugar, or 3 3/4 pounds. Invert port yeast, nutrient. Use method 1. Ferment the pulp with the raisins. 7. Blackcurrant wine, port style, 4 pounds. Blackcurrants, 7 pts. Water, 3.5 pounds. Sugar, or 4 pounds. Invert port yeast, nutrient. Use method 1. Ferment the pulp. 8. Blackcurrant claret, 3 pounds. Blackcurrants, 2. Half a pound. Sugar, or 3 pounds. Invert 7 pts. Water. All-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the diluted juice. 9. Blackcurrant wine, a light, sweet wine, 3. 3/4 pound. Blackcurrants, 3.5 pounds. Sugar, or 4 pounds. Invert 7 pts. Water. All-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the diluted juice. 10. Cherry wine, a delightful sweet wine, 8 pounds. Black cherries, 7 pts. Water, 3.5 pounds. Sugar, or 4 pounds. Invert all-purpose wine yeast or Bordeaux yeast. Nutrient. Use method 1. Weight with stones and ferment the pulp. 11. Cherry wine, a light dry wine, 8 pounds. Black cherries, 7 pts. Water, 2.5 pounds. Sugar, or 3. 1/4 pound. Invert, sherry yeast is best, otherwise all-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the strained diluted juice. 12. Red currant wine, light table wine, 3 pounds. Red currants, 7 pts. Water, 3 pounds. Sugar, or 3 3/4 pounds. Invert all-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the strained diluted juice. 13. Red currant wine, a light medium sweet wine. 4 pounds. Red currants, 7 pts. Water, 3.5 pounds. Sugar or 4 pounds. Invert. All-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the strained diluted juice. 14. Damson wine, port style, 8 pounds. Damsons, 7 pts. Water, 4 pounds. Sugar or 5 pounds. Invert. Port yeast, nutrient. Use method 1. Wait with the stones and ferment the pulp. 15. Damson wine, suitable for making into damson gin. See recent experiments. 5 pounds. Damsons, 7 pts. Water, 3 pounds. Sugar or 3.75 pounds. Invert. All-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 1. Wait with the stones. Ferment the pulp. 16. Damson and elderberry wine port style. 3 pounds. Damsons, 1.5 pounds. Elderberries, 3.5 pounds. Sugar or 4 pounds. Invert. Port yeast, nutrient, 7 pts. Water. Use method 1. Ferment the pulp. 17. Damson and dried prune wine. Burgundy style. Prunes should be soaked overnight, the water discarded, and the prunes added in the crushed state to the crushed damson. 4 pounds. Damsons, 2 pounds. Dried prunes, 7 pts. Water, 3 pounds. Sugar or 3.75 pounds. Invert. Burgundy yeast, nutrient. Use method 1. Ferment the crushed pulp. 18. Raspberry wine, light, dry, 4 pounds. Raspberries, 2.5 pounds. Sugar or 3 pounds. 2 ounces. Invert. 7 pts. Water, sherry yeast or all-purpose wine yeast. Nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the strained diluted juice. 19. Raspberry wine, sweet dessert, 4 pounds. Raspberries, 1 pound. Raisins, 7 pts. Water, 3.5 pounds. Sugar or 4 pounds. Invert. All-purpose wine yeast and nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the strained diluted juice but with the chopped raisins for the first 7 days. 20. Elderberry wine, port style, 4 pounds. Elderberries, 7 pts. Water, 4 pounds. Sugar or 5 pounds. Invert. Port yeast, nutrient. Use method 1. Ferment the crushed pulp. 21. Elderberry wine, medium dry, 3.5 pounds. Elderberries, 3 pounds. Sugar or 3.75 pounds. Invert. 7 pts. Water, sherry yeast or all-purpose wine yeast. Nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the strained diluted juice. 22. Elderberry claret, dry, of course, 3 pounds. Elderberries, 2.5 pounds. Sugar or 3 pounds. Invert. 7 pts. Water, sherry yeast or all-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the strained diluted juice. 23. Plum wine, burgundy style, 8 pounds. Plums, any fully ripe variety is suitable, 7 pts. Water, 3 pounds. Sugar or 3.75 pounds. Invert. Burgundy yeast. Nutrient. Use method 1. Wait with the stones and ferment the crushed pulp. 24. Plum wine, port style, dark red, fully ripe fruits must be used. 10 pounds. Plums, 7 pts. Water, 3.5 pounds. Sugar or 4 pounds. Invert. Port yeast. Nutrient. Wait with the stones. Use method 1. Ferment the crushed pulp. 25. Rhubarb wine. This wine is best made on the dry side and used as an appetizer. If you try to make it sweet, it would have to be rather too sweet. 4 pounds of sugar will make it a medium sweet wine, but even this will not reduce the acidity which gives this wine its character, which unfortunately is causing it to lose its popularity. It's possible to remove the acid by using precipitated chalk, but this is hardly for beginners and a practice which in any case alters the whole flavor of the resulting wine. 5 pounds. Rhubarb, 3 pounds. Sugar or 3.75 pounds. Invert. 7 pts. Water, sherry yeast or all-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Crush the rhubarb with a rolling pin, starting in the Middle of each stick. Soak for 5 days in 3 pints of water boiled and in which 1 Campden tablet has been dissolved. Then strain. Wring out dry and warm just enough to dissolve half the sugar. Having done this, ferment for 10 days and then proceed as you would with any other recipe here, adding the rest of the sugar and water in stages. 26. Loganberry wine, 3 to 4 pounds. Loganberries, 3 pounds. Sugar or 3 3/4 pounds. Invert. Burgundy yeast, nutrient, 7 pts water. Use method 1. Ferment the crushed pulp. 27. Gooseberry wine, table wine, 6 pounds. Gooseberries, 3 1/2 pounds. Sugar or 4 1/4 pounds. Invert. 7 pts. Water, Tokay yeast or all-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 1, but ferment pulp for 3 days. 28. Gooseberry wine, sherry style. The best gooseberries for this wine are those that have been left on the bushes to turn red or yellow according to variety. They should be firm but soft and at the same time not damaged. Any damaged ones and any with a suggestion of mold or mildew on them must be discarded. For a dry sherry style, use 2 1/2 pounds. Sugar, for a medium dry, use 3 pounds. And for a medium sweet, use 3 1/2 pounds, or the corresponding amounts of invert sugar. 5 pounds. Gooseberries, 7 pts. Water, sugar as above, sherry. Yeast or all-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 1, but ferment the pulp for 5 days only. 29. Whortle berry wine, Burgundy style. Whortleberries are a small wild fruit which many people come to the country to pick. They make excellent jams and jellies and very good wines, otherwise known as hearts. 6 pts whortleberries, 7 pts. Water, 3 pounds. Sugar or 3 3/4 pounds. Invert, Burgundy yeast, nutrient. Use method 1. Ferment the pulp. 30. Whortle berry wine, Port style, 8 pts. Whortleberries, 7 pts. Water 4 pounds. Sugar or 5 pounds. Invert, port yeast, nutrient. Use method 1. Ferment the pulp. 31. Whortle berry wine, table wine, 5 pts. Whortleberries, 7 pts. Water, 2 1/2 pounds. Sugar or 3 pounds, 2 ounces. Invert, all-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 2. Ferment the strained diluted juice. 32. Slow wine. Slows make a delightful wine which is very popular with those living in the country, and is particularly suitable for turning into slow gin. Not more than 4 pounds should be used owing to their astringency. 4 pounds. Slows, 3 pounds. Sugar or 3 3/4 pounds. Invert, 7 pts. Water. All-purpose wine yeast, nutrient. Use method 1, but ferment pulp for 3 days only. Ribena wine tutorial. Before I explain how easy it is to make wine with Ribena, let me point out that this famous syrup of excellent quality could well be added to fermenting musts made up from the fruits to get special results. The rate to add it would be 1 to 2 bottles per gallon. When making wines from dried fruits, the addition of 1 or 2 bottles of Ribena per gallon would make a vast improvement to the flavor and quality of the wine. Similarly, when making wines from fresh fruits that give a red wine, 1 or 2 bottles or Ribena could well be added to make up for other fruits in this way. You may disregard the SO2 preservative. More about this later, because the amount in the Ribena will not be enough to stop fermentation, but it would be best to add it at the vigorous fermentation stage during the first 10 days. If you propose to use Ribena in this way, bear in mind that each bottle contains approximately 8 ounces of sugar, so you should reduce accordingly the amount of sugar in whichever recipes you're using. Undiluted Ribena is not readily fermentable, because it contains just over 7 pounds of sugar per gallon and is preserved with 350 parts per million SO2, either of which is capable of preventing fermentation. Obviously, our aim when making wine with Ribena will be to reduce the amount of sugar to about 3.5 pounds. per gallon, by using half Ribena and half water. In doing this, we shall reduce the SO2 preservative to around 175 parts per million. This amount is unlikely to prevent fermentation, though it could do so. My trials with Ribena were carried out with the above point borne in mind, and it will be seen that I began with a good deal less than equal parts or Ribena and water, gradually bringing them up to equal parts, because I did not want to overwork the yeast by giving it too much sugar to work on at the start, and because I wanted to reduce the SO2 content to below 175 parts per million without heating, with the risk of spoiling the flavor of the syrup. I decided to work to the following method. The method, incidentally, met with the approval of V. L. S. Charlie, BBC, Ph.D., Technical Director of the Royal Forestry Factory of the Beecham Group and one-time Director of the Long Ashton Research Station, Bristow. All water used in the process was first boiled and allowed to cool naturally. STAGE 1. 2 bottles of Ribena were diluted with twice the amount of water. 4 Ribena bottles full. Yeast in the form of a nucleus was added and the mixture allowed to ferment for 10 days. Stage 2. After 10 days fermentation, 2 bottles of Ribena and 1 Ribena bottle of water were added and the mixture allowed to ferment for a further 10 days. Stage 3. After a total of 20 days fermentation, 2 bottles of Ribena and 1 more bottle of water were added. Fermentation was then allowed to carry on to completion, taking, in all, 3 months. The result was a good, round wine flavored delightfully but not too strongly of fresh black currants. At stage 3 it was borne in mind that, while most of the SO2 would have been driven off during fermentation by adding those last 2 bottles, I was, in effect, bringing the total SO2 content up to 175 parts per million. Fearing that the yeast might be just a little weakened at this stage, one decided to drive off the SO2 in the last 2 bottles by raising the temperature of the to 70 C. If you want to do this and have no suitable thermometer, stand the bottles in a saucepan of water and slowly raise the temperature until the Ribena in the bottles has increased in volume enough to reach the rims of the bottles. The temperature is high enough to drive off the SO2 and the heat should be cut off at once. The caps of the bottles must be removed before heating. The whole of fermentation was carried out in narrow-necked bottles plugged with cotton wool, fermentation locks being fitted after 10 days. Racking was not carried out until 1 month after the last edition. Monthly racking followed until fermentation ceased. Even at this early stage the wine was nice to drink. But it had improved vastly at the age of 6 months. At first it might seem expensive to make wine with Ribena, but against the cost one should set the fact that no sugar need be added and that one has a top quality product all ready for the job in hand. Apart from this, there is no expensive fruit to buy, no messy crushing, in fact nothing much to do at all. And, most important of all, Ribena has been treated with a pectin-destroying enzyme, which means that you could boil it if you wished without fear of pectin clouding the finished wines. Such boiling would, of course, drive off the SO2 and give you a wine flavored slightly to cooked blackcurrants. It will be seen that a sweeter wine may be made by using 1 bottle more of Ribena or 1 less of water, while a dry wine would result if less Ribena were used. A dry wine would lack the fuller flavor, but this would be offset to some extent by to dryness. If 8 bottles of Ribena are made into 1 gallon by adding water, the gallon will contain roughly 4 pounds of sugar, and the equivalent of 4 pounds of black currants. This amount of fruit is ample for a gallon of wine and, provided one likes a fairly sweet wine, this proportion of sugar to fruit is not too much. On the whole, I feel that 7 bottles of Ribena would be the limit you could use to make a gallon of wine without it being too sweet. It will be clear that my trials with Ribena, using 6 bottles to make just under a gallon of wine, have been most successful, and I do urge readers to have a go. A point to bear in mind is that a good light wine is often made with as little as 2 pounds of blackcurrants to the gallon. Therefore, if you made 4 bottles of Ribena into a gallon of must, you would have used the equivalent of 2 pounds of black currants and 2 pounds of sugar. This would give you a wine of about 12% of alcohol by volume. Such a wine would be dry, but by adding half a pound of sugar during the process you would get a sweeter wine of 1 or 2% more alcohol. Extract tutorial. This chapter shows how easily wines the flavor of world famous liqueurs and other commercial products may be added with the minimum of utensils and labor. Indeed, this is probably, if not decidedly, the simplest, the least troublesome and the most rewarding of all adventures into wine making. In what are known as Tinwaret extracts we have a readily prepared ingredient and, as will be seen in the recipes, no preparation is needed, the stuff is ready to use. You might get a decent imported wine or British wine at 7 and 6 a bottle, but you will never be able to buy wines with the flavor of these world-famous liqueurs at any price, and certainly not for 30 cents a bottle all they will cost you to make. Nor will you ever buy vermouth at less than 50 cents a bottle. The vermouth recipe alone then must be worth a fortune to anybody who likes vermouth. When making these wines, do please use good yeast and nutrient, for the results obtained in this way will surpass any you can hope to achieve by using baker's yeast and no nutrient. It will be seen in the recipes that I have included invert sugar because this gives the best results here. Invert sugar contains a little acid, and this is essential in wine making, as we have already seen. If you use household sugar, you will have to add the juice of 1 lemon or 1/8 ounce of citric acid to give just the tiny amount of acid required. When adding the extract to the prepared syrup sugar water, make sure you get all of it out of the bottles. When deciding which extract to use, you must first decide on which you are likely to prefer, unless you know in advance and from experience that you like vermouth or kirsch or cherry brandy, and then choose that one. In this way you will make a wine that might disappoint you. After all, not all tastes are the same. Very important, the method we shall be using calls for adding these very highly concentrated flavorings to a very small amount of liquid to begin with. The flavor will be very, very strong, so don't sample it, and the odor given off might strike people as not quite pleasant. This is quite natural, so don't be put off using them because of this, and don't take a sniff of the wine during the early stages for the same reason. Tinwaret extracts and what they are made of. The following list contains the names of most of the Tinwaret extracts that we shall be using in this chapter, and beside each appears details of their contents. The extracts are scientifically blended to give flavors identical to the world-famous liqueurs of the same names. Thus you are assured of the real thing and not a synthetic substitute. These flavorings are highly concentrated and should not, therefore, be judged by their odor. Anyone smelling the raw, undiluted material or sampling the wines made from the extracts is likely to imagine that something is not quite right. Don't pay any attention to the strength or pungency of the odor, and do not sample any wines being made from the extract until fermentation has almost ceased. Even at this stage it is not wise to try to judge the wine. Wait, I implore you, until fermentation has ceased altogether and the wine has been clear for at least a month. As with all other wines, the flavor improves immensely with age. I am able to speak from first-hand experience because I have been making wines with these extracts, and I can assure you in absolute sincerity that each extract makes a wine identical in flavor to the world-famous commercial liqueur, the name of which it carries. And let me just add that the oil of juniper mentioned in other parts of this book is an extract of juniper berries, juniper being an ornamental shrub grown a good deal in this country. Liqueur green convent, liqueur yellow convent, both distilled from plants growing in the high mountain regions. These two established the now worldwide reputation of Tinwaret. Curacao, red curacao, white. Two liqueurs of Dutch origin distilled from small green oranges. Cherry brandy, made from unfermented cherries. Danzig, a liqueur of German origin. Kummel, of continental origin, extracted from caraway seed. Wine made from this extract would act as a stimulant of the digestive organs. Marabelle. distilled from the famous Lorraine plum. Prunelle, distilled from the wild plum. Many of the extracts contain blends of bitter and aromatic plants, vermouth being a good example of this. We are all well aware of the delicate flavors of the French and Italian vermouths and will thus be enabled to appreciate the value of all the terroir extracts, for they bring us something quite unique when it comes to making wines from them. These extracts were not intended for the purpose to which I put them. Making wines from them instead of fruit or other ingredients is my own idea entirely, and I am proud to be the originator of both the idea and of the recipes herein. I am also proud to pass them on to my readers all over the world. As will be seen in the recipes, I have advised carrying out the entire fermentation in the gallon jar, but if you would prefer to ferment for the first 10 days in a polythene pail, by all means do so, but make certain it is covered as directed earlier. If you do this, give the liquor a good stir before putting it into the jar, otherwise some of the deposit and a lot of flavoring may be lost. Do not on any account divide the liquor, say, into 2 half-gallon lots, because half-gallon jars happen to be available. Keep it as one until all fermentation has ceased. When this has happened, the clearer wine may be siphoned off the deposit into another jar and put away to clear. When clear, it should be bottled. Wines from citrus fruits. Make these wines with baker's yeast fresh. 61. Orange wine. This is a delightful wine that develops a flavor that can readily be likened to an orange-flavored whiskey. 12 large oranges, or their equivalent, 4-pound sugar, half an ounce. Yeast, 1 gallon. Water, nutrient. Drop the whole oranges into boiling water, and push each one under the surface. Then take them out and throw the water away. Cut the oranges into small pieces and pour over them half a gallon of boiled water that has cooled. Cover well, and leave to soak for 48 hours, crushing and pressing the peel between the fingers to extract the oil, which gives a very special flavor. Then boil half the sugar in a quart of water for 2 minutes, and when cooled, add this to the orange pulp. Then add the yeast and nutrient. Ferment this in a warm place for 5 days. Then crush, strain through fine muslin or other suitable material and wring out dry. Discard the pulp and return the fermenting liquor to the fermenting vessel and allow to ferment for a further 10 days. Carefully pour off into a gallon jar, leaving as much of the deposit behind as you can. Then boil the rest of the water and sugar together and, when cool, add to the rest. Then fit fermentation lock or cover as directed and continue to ferment in a warm place until all fermentation has ceased. 62. Lemon wine. This wine is not ordinarily made to drink as a wine. It is often made by experienced winemakers for blending with dried fruit wines, which sometimes fall short of acid requirement, but more often it is made as a novelty. It is particularly suitable for making into lemon gin wine. Use the above directions for making orange wine using 8 lemons instead of using oranges. 63. Grapefruit wine. This is another acid wine, but many people like it, especially where a pound of raisins or dates are fermented with the grapefruits. Use 8 large grapefruits following the orange wine recipe above. If you wish to add a pound of raisins or dates, do so as soon as you have cut up the grapefruits and ferment them with the rest for the first few days until straining time. Note: if raisins or dates are used, use half a pound less of sugar, because dried fruits contain approximately 50% sugar. 64. Tangerine wine. This makes a really delightful wine, and many tangerines may be used as suits you, but do not use less than 15 or more than 30. Dates or raisins may be used with this as well as in the grapefruit recipe, and the notes about this should be followed if you want to add them. However, I feel that you would find the raw fruits more to your liking. Follow the directions for orange wine when making tangerine wine, flower wines and miscellaneous recipes. Let me begin this chapter by assuring you that one of the loveliest wines I have ever tasted was made with gorse flowers by a member of the Bournemouth Winemakers Circle. This I sampled while lecturing at the town hall there on the occasion of the Amateur Winemakers' second annual conference and show. Flower wines cannot, of course, be likened to any other homemade wine or commercial wine because their flavors are unique. They can only be described as delicately aromatic. Their bouquet cannot be found in any other wine. Their popularity is lessened only by the labor of collecting the flowers, but by choosing a spot where they abound, enough for a gallon or two may be gathered in an hour. Care is needed if we are to get the best from our ingredients. When gathering the flowers, it is best to use a basket of ample size because crushing will damage the flowers, and we shall not get such a delightful wine. All flowers should be gathered on a dry day but not necessarily on a sunny one, though it must be sunny when collecting dandelions, otherwise they are either closed or half closed and difficult to find. In their closed state, they teem with insects which would get into the wine and spoil it. Dandelions close when gathered, but this does not matter. In fact, it is a great help because we should use only the petals of dandelions, and when they are closed the petals may be pulled out altogether merely by holding the head of the flower and pulling on the petals grouped together. Although only petals should be used, many people make quite good dandelion wine by using the whole heads, but I use petals only. To achieve the best result, a wine yeast should be used, and this may be an all-purpose wine yeast. Invert sugar should not be used in these recipes because it is inclined to slightly alter the aroma of the flower and change the delicate color of the wines made from recipes in this chapter. Baker's yeast is included in the recipe together with household sugar. Those preferring to use a wine yeast started as directed may, of course, do so. 65. Gorse wine. 5 pts. Gorse flowers, 3 pound sugar, 1 gallon. Water, 1 ounce. Yeast. 5 pints is the minimum amount of gorse flowers to use. You may use more if you wish, up to 1 gallon if you can get them. Other ingredients would remain the same. Put the flowers in the fermenting vessel and pour on half a gallon of boiling water. Cover and leave to soak for 3 days, stirring each day and covering again at once. Boil half the sugar in a quart of water for 2 minutes. And when this is cool, add the flour mixture. Then add the yeast and ferment for 3 days. Strain out the flowers and continue to ferment the liquor in the fermenting vessel for a further 7 days. Then pour into a gallon jar, leaving as much of the deposit behind as you can. Boil the rest of the sugar in the remaining water for 2 minutes, and when cool, add to the rest. Cover as directed or fit fermentation lock and continue to ferment until all fermentation has ceased. Note: many people prefer this when the juice of 1 lemon is added at the same time as the yeast. Terms and conditions. Legal notice. The publisher has strived to be as accurate and complete as possible in the creation of this report, notwithstanding the fact that he does not warrant or represent at any time that the contents within are accurate due to the rapidly changing nature of the Internet. While all attempts have been made to verify information provided in this publication, the publisher assumes no responsibility for errors, omissions, or contrary interpretation of the subject matter herein. Any perceived slights of specific persons, peoples, or organizations are unintentional. In practical advice books, like anything else in life, there are no guarantees of income made. Readers are cautioned to rely on their own judgment about their individual circumstances to act accordingly. This book is not intended for use as a source of legal, business, accounting, or financial advice. All readers are advised to seek services of competent professionals in legal, business, accounting, and finance fields. You are encouraged to print this book for easy reading. Don't leave before you press like button below and subscribe to this channel. As a subscriber, you will receive a new notifications every time a new video is uploaded. Good luck.